So welcome to the fourth and the last seminar in this spring series from the project BROKEX, Brokering China's Extroversion. Thanks to everyone who has loyally followed this series. We will continue in the fall using the same format with two people who have published books and then a discussion afterwards. So the seminar is recorded. We will have a discussion afterwards where questions can be sent in writing. My name is Heidi Østbehaugen. I'm a human geographer and a professor of China studies at the University of Oslo. And the project that this seminar is organized under is funded by the European Research Council, and it's about how China's global connections are made. Today we'll focus on the role of education in creating global China. So we have with us three scholars who have studied various ways in which transnational mobility and education and cosmopolitanism intersect. My colleague Yi'en Cheng has gracefully agreed to chair the seminar, and he will introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Heidi. So I guess we will start the seminar proper. Let me introduce myself. I'm Yi'en Cheng. I'm from the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore, and I will be the chair and discussant for today's seminar. And we are very honored to have two fantastic scholars on Chinese migrations, and in particular, focusing on educational research and international student mobility studies, joining us tonight. Our two speakers are Bingyu and Shuning Liu. So Bingyu is the author of a new book entitled New Chinese Migrants in New Zealand, Becoming Cosmopolitan, Roots, Emotions, and Everyday Diversity. And when she manages to join us tonight, her presentation will build on her recent work on returnees, and it's entitled A Temporal Turn in Migration, Times and Temporalities Amongst Chinese Scholars Returning from the Global North. Shuning Liu is the author of the fantastic book, Neoliberalism, Globalization, and Elite Education in China, Becoming International. So for tonight, I think we will begin with Shuning, if that is fine. Shuning will begin her presentation first. So let me introduce Shuning proper. Shuning is assistant professor in curriculum studies at the Teachers College, Ball State University. Her primary research interests are in the areas of critical curriculum studies, critical policy analysis, social theory, international education, globalization, and education. Her current research projects involve the role of international education in the formation of social elites. So I think this is what she's going to be speaking on today. So Shuning, anytime you are ready, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you for Yi'en's nice introduction. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here today to talk about my recently published book, Neoliberalism, Globalization, and Elite Education in China, Becoming International. Thank you for Professor Heidi Hogan for inviting me to this seminar. This book actually started out as my dissertation research project. Numerous people have helped me with the book. I want to first express my gratitude to the school administrators, teachers, students, and parents at the Sunny High International Schools, which pseudonym, as you can imagine. Thank you them for participating in this study, allowing me to observe their work and sharing their story and experience with me. Although their name must stay anonymous, the research participant and the study school have my deep appreciation. I also want to thank Professor Michael Apple, my major advisor, and Professor Stacy Lee. I have greatly benefited from many conversations with Michael. As some of you may know that he is a world-class critical curriculum theorist and social activist. So his wisdom and scholarship continue to inspire me. He's a role model for me, inspired me to become a public intellectual who work for the building of a more equal, just, and civic society. And Stacy has led me to the field of educational anthropology and taught me how to become an ethnographer. So my dissertation also, especially dissertation writing, also supported by Tasha Morgan, Wisconsin Distinguished Graduate Fellowship. Because of this, the support of this fellowship, I was able to fully focus on the writing to complete the dissertation. And also, of course, another research, a variety of research travel grants support me to do the field work. So to give you some little bit of background about the study I was doing, as many audience attending this seminar today may notice, in the recent decades, a number of urban Chinese high school students applied to US universities, and of course another Western universities, English-speaking Western universities. The number of such students have rapidly grown. Very interestingly, concomitantly, a growing number of key public high school, which I mean academically elite school in Chinese cities, has started to establish the international high school curriculum program. Some of them called international division, some of them called international curriculum program class, different name, but the nature are very similar. So this type of public international program are actually exclusively designed to prepare privileged urban Chinese students for international college applications. In my study, I focus more on US college application. So many of these students who want to apply to overseas universities, particularly top university in the US, more have chosen to attend newly established public international curriculum program. So this emerging international high school program created, again, I want to emphasize, I'm studying the many international programs in China, in the past decades, but my study focused on those international programs established by public elite Chinese high school, okay? So this program often integrates Chinese national high school curriculum with a variety of imported so-called international curricula, such as a general certificate of educational advanced level, abbreviated name is A-level, and also advanced placement, global assessment certificate, a variety of imported international program. They integrate them with the Chinese national high school curriculum to prepare these students for international college application. These programs are essentially public, but very interestingly, students who are able to choose this program needed to pay high tuition. How high it is? So I want to give you some general sense. So of course, you can imagine the tuition from different international programs are different, but too often they are ranged, the yearly tuition ranged from about 60,000 yuan to 120 yuan each year, which is far more expensive than any state as a yearly tuition. Usually charged about 800 to 2,000. You can see now the number difference. So it's clear only those students from wealthy family are able to afford this expensive tuition. So the pathway from an international program created by elite public high school in China to leading university in the US differentiate socially elite students whose family are able to pay high tuition fees and academically elite students. It also reflects a new development of Chinese elite public high schools and implies a new form of elite schooling, which leads students to prestigious university in the US. However, very interesting, the public international program I'm talking about are not uncontested. They have important implications for equity of educational opportunity for students to access elite universities and the associated life awards in changing local, national, and global context. So the guiding questions in this book are helpful. First one is more about the program. I try to understand why did this emerging international high school curriculum program emerge at a particular time in China? How was this program constructed? Why do Chinese students choose to attend this particular type of international focused Chinese public high schools? What is the decision-making process look like? What education is for? The sense of belonging and the goal, aspirations, concern, challenge, and struggle. So to explore the answer of these questions, I draw on critical theories, particularly critiques of neoliberalism, globalizations, internationalizations, and also critical social spatial theories, Bourdieu's notion of field, capital, habitats, and critical curriculum studies from Basil Bornstein, UK sociologist of education, sociologist of curriculum, and Michael Apple's work on ideology and curriculum and official knowledge. So for detail, you can see the book, chapter 2. In terms of the research design, I used a critical qualitative research, which means I apply sociological and anthropological approach to the study of educational practices of the emerging international high school curriculum programs and the rising Chinese upper middle and upper classes and socially elite Chinese students, as well as educational policies nationally and globally. So as some of you who have read the book, you can see the book is not a traditional bounded ethnographic case study, on school community. Rather, I followed ethnographically educational neoliberal educational policies, and they followed through different levels, from meso level, from macro level, in terms of what happened in the international and national context, and also meso level in terms of the institution practice, and micro levels in the specific schools and the families and students. So in different space, I examined how neoliberal policies are taken up on the ground at a particular school and by rising upper middle and upper Chinese elite classes. So through analyzing a variety of data source, the book integrates curriculum studies with critical educational policy studies to explore the complexity of socially elite Chinese students' choice and the subsequent educational experience with the international program in China. My study actually points out the complexities is derived from the involvement and the interactions of multiple social actors, as showed in my chapter for, I believe, the network, I use network analysis to map out the multiple social actors get involved in the development, establishment, and development of this particular international program. So also my study pointed to the internal, external contradictions between and among multiple fields surrounding the privileged Chinese student choice and preparation for US college applications. To give you some brief glance of the findings of this study. The first findings, even I already addressed that in the book, but I thought maybe it's worthwhile highlighting some major findings in this seminar. One of the findings is about like how this public, so-called public international high school program are regarded as an educational experiment. Very interestingly, my research highlights this public international program were framed as an educational experiment to improve Chinese high school new curriculum reform. They are legitimated as the Chinese foreign collaboration in running school policy, high school program, but the unique institutional structure of these policies bring private education companies into the development of these high school curriculum programs. I found that the intervention, as the book highlights, the intervention of the private institutions into Chinese public educational reform are actually tacit business practice. In addition, what impressed me in doing this research, the discourse such as internationalizing Chinese education and cultivating international talents for Chinese economic development and international competitiveness, which underlied this discourse, underlined in the national guidelines for medium and long-term educational reforms and development from 2010 to 2020, actually furthered provide Chinese elite public high schools with relative autonomy to create US college-going curriculum and pedagogy for meeting the need of socially elite Chinese students. Another interesting finding is about like international pathways to leading university in the US. As I addressed about the intercessions of international curriculum into the Chinese national educational system actually creates an international track in local elite public schools in China that set privileged Chinese students on paths that lead them to world-class university in the US. As the study schools over and over again emphasized, the school tried to work on the curriculum in integration, and it becomes more apparent that the acquisition in this particular school I studied, the acquisition of English language skill and the knowledge of math, science, American society, and literature are more valued because these skills and knowledge are measured by US tests. By contrast, Chinese subject, particularly Chinese language arts and other humanity, are downgraded to the rhetorical study of Chinese culture. To a large extent, US college entry exams, such as TOEFL, which means test of English as a foreign language, and ACT, SAT, advanced placement exam, actually replaced China's Gaokao. And this US Gaokao, the participant emphasized, many participants emphasized, the U.S. Gaokao shaped the organization and even the content of school curriculum and mold school pedagogical practice. My study point out the changing power over what counts as official knowledge. What counts as official knowledge? This is a question actually we should ask, especially in this emerging international high school in China. The third finding I'd like to share, major finding I'd like to share to folks here is the U.S. college-going school cultures not only impact formal schooling, but also informal schooling. To better prepare Chinese students for U.S. college application, the particular international programs that I studied have also tended to develop a college counseling and guide system that focus on helping student teachers understand U.S. college admission criteria. In addition to those college entry test scores, Chinese students and teachers came to understand U.S. college and universities have a wide scope to consider: grade point, average GPA, student extracurricular activity, personal statement, recommendation letter, so on and so forth. They realize that U.S. college autonomous enrollment and multiple admission criteria are distinctively different from China's Gaokao, Chinese college admission, that actually largely depend on a solely criteria, which called Gaokao, score on Gaokao. This distinction led to U.S. college-going school cultures, which has had a profound impact on teaching the learning at the emerging public international high school program. So the last finding I'm sharing today is about how these privileged students overwhelmingly use their family economic capitals to buy educational service from English training and study abroad consulting companies. So, as I said, to deal with the complexity of U.S. college application process, socially elite Chinese students have intensively engaged in extracurricular and after-school educational activities. The informal schooling often involves taking international trips to U.S. and experience overseas life, attending U.S. university summer schools, traveling to Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea to take SAT, ACT test, participating in internship and contest for the accumulation of distinctive extracurricular experience, putting them on the profile when they apply for U.S. college, and taking English test cram classes for TOEFL, for SAT, for ACT, and more importantly, working with study abroad consulting companies. My study highlights that these privileged Chinese high school students overwhelmingly use families' economic capitals to buy this educational service. In the meanwhile, it shows the massive marketization of international education. So in terms of the summary, my study reveals that under the support of market-based educational reforms in both local and international context, upper middle and upper class Chinese families utilize a variety of educational markets, such as global higher education market, the Chinese education market, the study abroad educational consulting market, to mobilize various type of capitals for producing a social advantage that better positions the kids in the privileged world-class university in the US. As my study demonstrated, this emerging public international high school curriculum program actually provide privileged urban Chinese students with fast, shortcut international tracks in Chinese elite public schools to top universities in the US. This reproduction of social advantage through education, especially through new form elite education, international education, implies a new form of elite education that actually articulate local and global force for the production of power and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuning, for this wonderful presentation, lending us some very deep insights into the research sites that you were that sort of informed your presentation today. Bingyu is Associate Professor at the School of Sociology and Anthropology at Yat-sen University. She's also on the editorial board of Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Bingyu's research is of interdisciplinary nature and involves a wide range of issues around labor precarity, migrant well-being, and diversity in societies. She specifically focuses on migration and mobilities, intercultural encounters, and cosmopolitanism, with a geographical focus on the Asia Pacific. So let's Bingyu take over now with her presentation, and anytime you're ready, Bingyu, you can start the ball rolling.
Okay. So thank you for the invitation from Heidi that I can have the chance to share my research with all of you, and then I'm quite happy that Shuning and Yi'en are joining us today. So the presentation I'm making today is entitled "Temporal Turn in Migration, Times and Temporalities Amongst Chinese Scholars Returning from the Global North." So the presentation today, it will be divided into two sections. The first part, I will be briefly introducing my own research for the past few years, and then the second part will be specifically on this topic. So I finished my PhD in 2017 in Auckland University of New Zealand. During my PhD studies, I focused on new Chinese migrants in New Zealand under the theoretical framework of cosmopolitanism. And then after my PhD studies, I joined Sun University in China and then started to look at academic migration to and from China. So specifically looking at three empirical groups. The first one is Chinese academic returnees, and the second, which is also the empirical case study of the topic today. And then the other two groups are foreign scholars in China and then Chinese knowledge diaspora. And then apart from academic migration, I have me and my students have recently looked at the immobilities of Chinese international students during the pandemic period. So, and then after that, and before that, I also look at the Honiao migrants in China, and then the young people's lifestyle mobilities within China. And then apart from those highly skilled and more elite forms of migration, I have also looked at African migrants in Guangzhou, so as a form of South migration. So the research I've been doing for the past few years are basically trying to capture and better describe those empirical trends happening in the global migration landscape. So the first one, I think, is super diversity. So with this empirical trend, the theoretical approach I've been trying to adopt is the cosmopolitanism theoretical framework. So under this term, I have basically tried to look into the temporal dimension, emotional dimension, the rooted dimension, and the everyday dimension. So the book that I have published with Routledge basically covers all those perspectives. This is the table of contents of the book. So, and then the second empirical trend, I think, is happening in the migration field. Empirically, is there's a shift from permanent migration moving towards the temporary, more secular forms of migration. And the theoretical approach I've been engaging with is the time and temporalities. Under this term, I have utilized time and temporalities to look at academic returnees and also the role played by time and temporalities amongst Chinese migrants in New Zealand regarding their migration aspirations and the process of becoming cosmopolitan. And the third empirical trend I have captured is we could see more a stronger sense of precarity and uncertainty. And addressing this empirical trend, I have adopted the emotional term. So under this framework, I have touched on how emotions interact with cosmopolitan sociabilities and how precarity is involved in the lifestyle of migrants of China, and how Chinese Western scholars in China encounter all kinds of bodily experiences in a transnational setting. So the last empirical trend is more and more scholars, including myself, have started to look at immobilities to counterbalance the mobility bias happening in migration landscape. So under this empirical trend, the theoretical approach I have been engaging with is migration infrastructures. So recently, me and one of my graduate students have written one article to discuss how African migrants in China to overcome a set of infrastructure barriers to refine their living experiences in China. So now this is finally the second part of the presentation will be specifically on Chinese academic returnees under temporal framework. So this presentation will be divided into these following sections. I think with time limitation, we will try to maybe skip the methodological part maybe. So I think temporary, it has been widely argued that temporary and episodic labor has gradually become a typical feature of modern academic life. And those non-tenure track academics, different from those privileged ones, they don't have permanent positions, so they can form the so-called academic underclass. So most of the time they are thrown into a state of constantly waiting and living in limbo. So they are stuck between giving up the chosen career they have trained for years to enter and not knowing whether and when they can actually settle down in academia. So, but for those mobile non-tenure track academics, they encounter another set of challenges due to the global shift away from permanent migration towards those more temporary circular forms of migration. And in the meantime, it has been argued that the education migration pathway in the global north regions and countries has become increasingly uncertain and challenging. So for those academic migrants, especially those moving from the global south to the OECD countries, they are generally, they tend to generally encounter a set of settlement difficulties, struggling to land on those permanent positions in their host countries. They have to grapple with the state of being temporary. So this temporariness in their life is most likely to reshape the way they organize their lives in every single way, their family lives, their social lives, and the way they progress their career trajectories, and disrupting their feelings of security, social belonging, and aspirations for the future as well. So, but the occurrence and impact of this temporariness in academic migration, especially at the personal and the more individual level, have not been well understood yet. So this paper aims to bring academic migration into conversation with largely separate but also important debates around time in migration. Before going into the theoretical part of the study, I want to talk about some of the empirical background of this study. So ever since the 1990s, Chinese government has adopted a diaspora option to attract overseas scientists and intellectuals to return, and more recently, the government has been implementing a set of talent programs to further stimulate the return. And but in the meantime, as I have just mentioned, the education migration pathway has become increasingly challenging in the West. So and also the academic employment opportunities are not that available. So especially so under this kind of context, for those academic Chinese scholars overseas who are stuck in this permanently temporary status in their host countries, the top Chinese research university have thus become a more promising option for these younger academics, overseas Chinese academics. So thus, a significant reverse brain drain has emerged. So we can see that the percentage of returnees accounting for the overall number of studying abroad has grown steadily for the past 5 to 6 years. Actually, for the past 1 decade also, there are more and more students returning after their studies from overseas. So the number of these returning, the returning flow of these academic returnees have been growing stronger and stronger. But we have to bear in mind that not all the early career Chinese academic returnees, actually many of them, especially those like share the similar disciplinary background of us, like in the social science category, they cannot land on a permanent job offer to be recruited under a prestigious talent program. So they have to settle for those alternative work contracts. In a way, they can be thrown into another set of being temporary in China. So my study will not only look at the temporary precarity before the return, but also after the return. And also I wanted to look at if some of them demonstrate the capacity of engaging temporary labor to overcome the temporary dissonance they encounter in and through their moving process. So here I have outlined some of the classic and representative and some of my own recent research conducted under the temporal theoretical framework in migration studies. I think Kerner, the 2001 publishing GEMS, has been definitely acknowledged as the foundation piece under this time and temporality literature. So drawing on all those studies, I understand time in a more quantitative and objective sense. But in contrast, temporality is the lived and the subjective experiences of certain people towards their time in the past, present, and future. So temporalities are definitely socially experienced and dynamic. So we can simply understand time in a more objective way, and temporality is more like emotions, subjectivities in a more subjective way. So specifically within this research, I have developed a multi-layer understanding of being temporary. So into 3 layers. The first layer of being temporary refers to those normative, objective temporal constraints placed on those mobile academics by external and institutional factors such as visa status, the time length of their specific visa, the time length of their work contracts. The second layer of being temporary means apart from putting on normative temporal constraints on mobile individuals, time can also be utilized by the governments or institutions as a disciplinary practice or tool to regulate and control the mobility trajectories of these people. So actually being temporary is actually creating a tangible and intangible constraints on how migrants live and work. So drawing boundaries between those temporary ones and those permanent ones, both legally and socially. So those people under the more temporary visa status are actually confined into a very specific or limited academic labor market gaps. So their career and life aspirations could be negatively affected by their status of being temporary. The third layer of being temporary refers to being temporary could construct particular kinds of migrant subjectivities, which is migration temporalities, and being temporary can put those migrants into living in limbo, generating their sense of insecurity, anxiety, and other sorts of emotional precarities. But we also have to know that those migrant subjectivities can in turn activate a set of strategic responses in their lives, which is their agency accessed by the individuals. So those above 3 layers of being temporary shows that time and temporalities together quantitatively and qualitatively transform the everyday features of migrant lives, influencing or reshaping their sociabilities, subjectivities, mobility strategies, and trajectories altogether. So after this theoretical framing of the article, I think the methodology part, I outlined some bullet points for the methodology employed in this study. I have conducted the 40 in-depth interviews with early career, the younger ones who finished their PhD within 5 to 8 years. And then they were born in China mainland to receive the PhD in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, specifically these 3 countries. So employed by top Chinese universities, and their disciplinary backgrounds are quite diverse. Their work contracts ranging from long-term 10-year ones, long-term ones to more temporary posts. Their age is like 30 to 35, around that early mid-30s. The research findings I want to discuss today are divided into these 3 sections: temporal precarity, to match the 3 research questions I outlined earlier in the PPT. So will be temporal precarity before and after the return, and the temporal labor. So one of the interviewees mentioned that, so F means she's female. When I interviewed her, she was 31. She got her PhD in New Zealand. She returned to China in 2016. She was in, I think she was, she was in social science, and she was employed as a postdoc fellow. So she mentioned that when she was in New Zealand, she was quite struggling, that she couldn't find jobs under a non-resident visa. She felt she was in a catch-22 situation. Kim's narrative and some other interviewees, the narratives of Kim and some other interviewees suggest that the visa status, their state of being temporary in general in New Zealand, definitely have exerted negative effects in their academic labor market performance. So which in a way like disrupted their career aspirations in the global north, and also being temporary generate a sense of temporal vulnerability and precarity to construct Kim and some other interviewees as outsiders on different levels, which is why that in this narrative, Kim mentioned that she burst into tears when she saw a road sign saying temporary near one of the construction sites. That was one of the defining moments during my interviewing process. And then another narrative of Jake. He finished his PhD in Australia. He was in the STEM category. When I interviewed him, he really he expressed strong emotions. He was saying that if he doesn't go back to China as soon as possible, he's gonna face a broken marriage. So basically, his sense of being temporary here, as we can see from the narrative, was intensified by the expectation and obligation within his family, from his family in China. He mentioned that it is going to take him another half year to wait for the postdoc application outcome, and then it's going to take him even longer time to know the outcome of his application for PR. So this increasing waiting time and the constantly changing immigration policy, especially regarding PR policy of Australia, put him into this distressing state that he finally decided to return to China. So these 2 narratives suggest that facing temporary barriers to both professional development and family stability, many of the young Chinese academic scholars decided to return to China, hopefully to end their state of being temporary. But unfortunately, returning to China doesn't really solve the problem. So next, let's look at what kind of temporary precarity they're gonna suffer from after returning to China. So one of the interviewees, Angela, she described that her move from Australia to China was like jumping from one hell to another. She was mentioning that she was under this 3-year contract and she had to publish certain amount of SSCI journal articles to renew her work contract. So she felt quite stressed out. So the narrative of Angela actually echoes this grim picture of many newly returned young Chinese scholars. To a certain degree, they are actually being exploited by the academic mobility regime operated by the state. So they are shaping into those output-focused academic bodies that work in a like machine-like fashion. But as much as they want to try to renew their work contract, they don't really know when or whether and how they can end their state of being temporary, or they will eventually leave the industry of academia. They have 20 years to enter. And so apart from attracting overseas scholars to return, the Chinese government has also tried to set up a set of state fellowships to sponsor Chinese scholars, Chinese students to study overseas. But one of the conditions that those people have to return to China for a certain period of time as one of the obligations to receive this money from the government. So Ice here, he mentioned that he knew he had to return to China after his PhD, but now he is feeling like quite stuck in this place. He couldn't really start a family or a long-term relationship with people, as he felt he was just a contract worker. He didn't feel permanent himself. He didn't want to really think long-term under that kind of living realities. So those narratives suggest that so the Research Council, I think he mentioned China Scholarship Council, one of the major founding bodies of the Chinese government. CSC basically quite effectively impose these normative temporal constraints on those mobile scholars to regulate and control the temporal specialities of their career trajectories, try to try to obtain or absorb as much human capital or cultural capital from those returning scholars. I think all the governments I think Singapore is also trying to do similar things. One of my friends mentioned that they wanted the people to return to work for the local universities for a period of years before they could leave or go overseas again. So we could say that the increasingly difficult education migrant pathways in the West and the increasingly competitive and demanding academic mobility framework in China together put those younger scholars into a state of being temporary. And fundamentally, we could say that those more institutional temporal narratives intimately affect the everyday life patterns of these young scholars, and also arrange reorganize the way they advance their life advancement and career progressions. So facing all those kind of miserable temporal precarities both before and after their return, like exercising agency was still a very strong claim, a theme emerged from my narratives. So those interviewees, some of the interviewees demonstrated 3 types of temporal labor they engage in to overcome the temporal dissonance they encounter. The first time is some of them chose to engage in a positive waiting period to alter those supposedly precarious stage into something meaningful that leading to long-term employment opportunities. And we shouldn't simply understand this positive waiting or working hard, like in Chinese, like 既来之则安之, those kind of things, as absence of action, but is also like agentive long-term project to to wait for more long-term opportunities coming up. The second type of temporary labor is that many interviewees were saying that they want to try their best to maintain or obtain a multi-layered academic membership, basically to maintain a simultaneous presence both in China and overseas, to avoid the danger of being being stuck with double absence, like to avoid being thrown into academic immobilities, to waste the cultural capital or academic capital they have accumulated when they were studying overseas.
Bingyu, can I interrupt a little bit?
Yeah.
Can you try and wrap up in the next
Yeah. It's gonna be finished within 2 minutes. So the last type of temporary labor is imagining multiple way of future career possibilities. Many of them mentioned that they could imagine the possibility of leaving academia. So to conclude, this article theoretically mainly just contribute to the temporary turn in migration studies. Empirically, it has reflected the newly emerged north-south academic migration pattern, drawing our attention to the growing trend of precarity or temporariness involved in modern academia, especially in a cross-border setting. And also, I want to highlight that maybe it is sound to perceive those mobile scholars as a more elite form of precarious who sit in between those truly elite global citizens and those marginalized transnational wage laborers. And the second thing I want to highlight that this article, by not only focusing on the precarity but also agency, may offer some insights or remind us to alert us to consider how those other forms of temporary migration regimes worldwide are transforming mobile people's subjectivities and living paradigms, whether and how these precarious or regardless the more elite form or less elite form precarious, how they can obtain a greater sense of control of their time to pursue better migration and life outcomes. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Bingyu. That's another fascinating presentation there. Very insightful notes that you've presented us with. A lot to think about. I just want to give a sort of a very brief and quick comment. I find both presentations very interesting in the sense that both Shuning and Bingyu, you guys were talking a lot about international education, but in a sense intersecting with mobility and senses of cosmopolitanism in very different ways. So for Shuning, you were talking about how there is a form of emerging in situ internationalization. Like students are preparing for overseas education way before at a younger age when they are in public high schools, right? And there is this emerging sense of marketization of the public schooling landscape in China. And you focus a lot more on the travelings of migrants and the different kinds of social statuses and conversions of their positionalities in terms of the precarity, whether they are abroad or whether they are returning migrants. So I think there's something very interesting there happening in how we should be, or how we can alternatively theorize or think about international education, especially for Chinese migrations. I think the audience has many questions. I have many questions, but I should be prioritizing some of the questions that have already come in. Maybe I will pose one question to Shuning first, and let Bingyu, have a quick rest from her presentation. So Shuning, there's a question from, it's an anonymous audience. Shuning, the audience asks, some students are not able to pass the Chinese Gaokao and go into their aspire or desired university domestically. And then therefore they are pushed to US US 高考 instead, what do you think about this phenomenon? So I guess in a sense, the question is asking, that these students did not do well in the Chinese Gaokao, and therefore, the option of going to the US becomes an alternative. And ironically, it is an expensive option. So how do you, what are your comments about, this emerging phenomenon in China?
Thank you for this good question. To answer, to respond to this question, I can share one of the finding, is a majority of student participants, even their parents, in my interview with them, they emphasize one of the main reasons why they choose this public international high school is because they didn't get high score enough in Zhongkao to allow them to attend Chinese public elite high school. This is one of the major reasons why. What does it mean, this so-called failure, which means that they have less chance to attend Chinese elite universities. Did you see the traditional conventional elite path from Chinese key public school to Chinese elite university? Because of this interruption, they take a detour to go to US world-class universities, which very interestingly give more valued academic capital if they get a diploma from US college. I think the questions, the audience question, also ask, how do I see the functions of this type of new international program? On the one hand, they did provide great opportunity for this socially elite. Socially elite, it's students who are not academic elite, but they come from wealthy family, who can provide, the family can provide more economic, culture, or even social capital to allow them to pursue this international pathway to US universities. So I think the question implies some underlying question is how we can see, on the one hand, this program did provide opportunity for this group of students, but on the other hand, did create unequal access to internationalized education. So question point to how we should understand the redistribution of educational policy in terms of how to understand social justice in national and international global context. I open this question, for all of us to think about. Of course, we needed, when we think about provide quality, equal educational opportunity to students, for all students, not just for small segment or group of students. I would think, this audience, to extend this question, thinking about, the implications, the good sense and bad sense of this new international program in a more overarching perspective. Did I answer this question?
Well, I guess in a sense, you have sort of broadened out the question for us to really critically think about. But Shuning, I also am very interested in finding out more about this emergence of private industry that you mentioned in the book. I find it quite fascinating that, but in a sense, to some degree, unsurprising that the private industry players actually step in to, tap into the opportunities opened up by the market gap, right? And that is to sort of provide these middle-class families, the parents and the children, the sort of resources that the public schools are unable to provide for them, especially pertaining to, access to elite US overseas education. I'm wondering whether the Chinese state has any form of, control, or how does the Chinese state manages the private education market in China?
Very thoughtful question, Yi'en. Actually, this question tied to the current Chinese educational policy to try to control supplementary education, extra curriculum in China is ongoing one, right? This is connected. As my book, one of the arguments I made in the book is, I think Chinese state, one of the strategy is they use the experimental role in the economic field, the same logic to the educational reform. When they try to, this is one of the argument why we should understand market-oriented social reform, also educational reform, in a more deeper way. So its impact, this market-oriented reform impact in the field of economy, but also in the field of public space, including education. So once you open the market and the privatization of education, more problem will pop up. And what I see the Chinese education, the formation, the trend of Chinese education policies at the beginning, allow them to develop in the way, keep it open. But once the public have debate, have some complaint on that, let's take it seriously and to develop some, to have some discussion on that. I think this is back to what Heidi asked the question, how the intellectual elite who cannot who access elite public school but cannot not afford this international program, how do they feel? How do they reaction to this type of international program? So there is debate. There's debate. For example, around 2015, the government stopped approving more public international program that I'm studying. It's just like so far have about like 90 such program throughout the China have been approved. But after that, the government stopped approving more. It's because the public have debate on this new type of program. One of the argument is this program used the public educational resource to benefit socially elite, wealthy, so students from wealthy families. So this is controversial topic I want to emphasize. Thank you for the question.
Yes, I guess also in the sense that resistance might come from various different groups in the society, and the middle class themselves might protest to these sort of control, increasing control over their their own perceived strategies to better their livelihoods in a sense, right? So I think that's quite interesting.
One more point. Just one more point. And your question, connect with the founding's argument I made in the book is the Chinese state struggled with that and struggled with this type of educational phenomenon, but many others that really struggled when they try to, on the one hand, to control this emerging problem deriving from the marketization, privatization of education, but on the other hand, there's something they cannot be controlled, right? This is a conflicting between the socialist collective ideology and their public interest is from state perspective, and the private interest, we would say, the conflict, the tension is there.
Thank you, Shuning. I want to sort of pose the next question to Bingyu. Bingyu, are you with us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Great. So there is this question about, you're talking a lot about, how returning migrants experience different forms of temporal precarities. And there's a question around, whether, these returnees to China, whether they are inspired by, or whether they are driven by a sense of desire to seek a more stable life than what they can achieve in academia abroad, and what are their sort of emotional complications, what are emotional experiences that they face when they have, in a sense, when they are forced to return to China. So maybe you can share and elaborate a little bit more with us.
I'm sorry. So, Ian, did you mean the emotional dynamics they had during their decision-making process?
So when the student returnees, when they are in a sense forced to return to China because they cannot, they are unable to seek employment overseas, what are the kinds of different emotional experience that they undergo? Can you share with us a little bit more on that?
Okay, so I think for at least within the narratives that I have collected from my interviewees, most of them basically expressed a sense of temporal vulnerability and precarity and anxiety during the process of them trying to look for more long-term employment opportunities. So one of the catch-22 situation is that I'm not quite sure about Australia or Canada, but I think they share similar migration regime with New Zealand. So in New Zealand, you have to land on a full-time job offer that is related to your major that you pursued, your studies you pursued in New Zealand. Otherwise, you are not really allowed to even apply for the resident class visa in New Zealand. But the ironic thing is that, especially for academia industry or for education industry, without a resident visa, it is more challenging to find a more long-term, relatively long-term or permanent job offer without a resident class visa. So I think you guys maybe have heard some stories that, so if a university want to employ a foreigner, this employer, like either a university or a company, has to write up a formal letter to the Immigration New Zealand or something to explain why they have to choose over a national to employ a foreigner for this specific position. So many interviewees mentioned that they felt they were constructed as these outsiders on different levels. Like they were confined into a very liminal academic labor market position. They couldn't find jobs that qualify or match their qualifications or experiences and capacities. So during this job hunting process in their host countries, they couldn't find a satisfying job offer that match their career aspirations. I mean, they could try to give up academia as their career to become a chef, and then they can maybe on a faster track to get a resident class visa in New Zealand, Australia, or New Zealand. But many of them, you know, like we have spent almost 20 years in studying. So they, after getting a PhD, I don't think many of them are inclined to become a chef after that. Not saying chef is not a good profession. I'm just saying, you know, like so they were exposed to different levels of anxieties, sense of inferiorities, and also they were very worried that they would generate a gap in their academic career. You know, like if we spend 2 or 3 years not being on the academic track, then the next university would ask, where were you during those 2 years? So they were kind of in a very liminal, in-between position. Yeah. So eventually, many
go on.
Oh no, I was fine. You go.
I just wanted to quickly catch onto the idea. I mean, what you just finishing your response with, and that is the idea that you know, this returning students, after spending so many years in higher education, they no longer, I mean, they would rather stay in academia than to exit academia. I think this sort of connects to this sort of larger issue, structural issue all around the world of academic precarity, of oversupply of PhD graduates. I specifically am curious about whether that form of desire to stay in academia, is it more, or to what extent is it produced by the Chinese state or the Chinese sort of a schooling system, the pursuit for educational excellence? And I don't know, I'm just wondering where that desire, that aspiration is coming from, right? I think because there is that, I'm sure we all know, there is that emerging discourse around, how can we, help PhD graduates, look for alternative career pathways. And I wonder how much of that is emerging from your research at this particular moment in time, because I think your research is at this juncture, in time whereby, a lot of things, people are just not getting jobs, and people are trying to decide whether to exit or to stay and be, temporarily or permanently experiencing that temporal precarity in that sense, right? So I think that there's that interesting sort of a dilemma there, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I understand, and I think that's a really good question. That so the academia industry across the globe has become increasingly accelerating, commercialized, and short-terminized. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, episodic and temporary labor has become like a dominant trend of the modern academia industry. So after completing PhD, is in no way you can easily land on a permanent job offer. That's not only the case with Chinese or Chinese scholars. It's happening everywhere. But despite of that, I think I do agree that it's just my speculations. I think it's not only a Chinese value, maybe a pan-Asian value as well. I'm not sure, like Confucianism that Chinese people tend to, especially for those who, as you can imagine, like they went overseas for PhD studies. So they most of them tend to have a quite, at least middle-class family background. And at least culture-wise, they have their family and themselves mainly tend to put a high value on their on education. So they have already land on a PhD certificate. I think it is very difficult for them to abandon all those years of effort. So that's one of the reasons. And another one is, I think Chinese people, as I have been telling some of my students and friends quite often, that Chinese people have this obsession with on-time life course advancement. So like 30而立 or something, like when you reach the age of 30, you want to have a stable career, stable family. So for my interviewees, most of them after finishing PhD worldwide is like at the age of 30, up and like around 30. So I think they have this strong desire to settle down, and being an academic, being a professor, being a lecturer in a university has been generally perceived as a very prestigious and very stable or glorious profession pathway, career pathway. So I think they had to make every effort to make sure that they have the chance to enter that industry. But having said that, some interviewees, as I mentioned in the agency, the last section of the research finding part, some interviewees do admit that even if they are right now working for the academia industry, they do, even including myself, I do accept the possibility of leaving academia someday. I think that's a worldwide phenomena as well, that we have to admit the fact that people are starting to think the option of leaving academia as the industry has becoming more and more commercialized, and the deadline rush, all kinds of those commercializing trend happening. Yeah, but there are indeed some Chinese characteristics.
Sure. Rob, we have about a few minutes left, but I do want to ask this question. We are living the moment of the COVID-19 right now. And this is a question for both Shuning and Bingyu. I wonder how is the COVID-19 and the sort of geopolitical implications that China is experiencing right now with its neighbors, but also with the US and other countries right now. How is it going to change this, the idea of international student mobility, right? I mean, in Shuning's case, you're talking a lot about, the desire for US education, and therefore there is this emerging preparatory school, this sort of privatization of public high schools, preparing young Chinese for a US education overseas. And Bingyu, your research is really about international students, going to pursue sort of, in some sense, Western forms of credentials. With COVID-19, racism, and all these geopolitical implications, can the both of you just sort of respond or give some comments on how do you think the pandemic is going to shift or change or may not change international student mobility in both the near future and beyond that? So maybe Shuning, you want to say something about it first?
Thank you, Yi'en, for this timely question. I will respond to this question in two ways. One way is regarding this type of international schools in China who focus on preparing Chinese students to study abroad, because this pandemic significantly interrupt this pathway, and because of visa, because of policy, especially thinking about right now the tension between US and China. And I can give you one example. One of my friends who actually sent his son to an international school in Beijing, which is different from the international school I studied. The school I studied is established by elite public high school, but my friends sent his son to a completely private international school. They pay very expensive, even more expensive tuition than the school I studied. And many of his son's students dropped from the school because they didn't find a good future in the upcoming years. They tried to go back to attend the Chinese public schools. This is just one example, but this example shows us how this international school quickly emerged, booming in China, is actually largely impacted by many things. What happened in China, what happened in the US, and what happened globally. Okay, we will see how it will happen in the next couple of years. So my hunch would be, once this pandemic getting better, the trend will keep going, but significant, maybe some number will drop, but maybe in the future will rise again. So my second way to answer your question is, actually, I'm doing longitudinal ethnographic study, following the group of students I studied in the book we are discussing now. I follow them from China to US university. Right now, they graduated from US college, and some of them attend graduate program. Some are already graduated from a master program. And because of the pandemic, it impacted the job search in the US. Even some of them find a temporary job in very good international companies in US. Because of visa issues, they have to return to China to find a job. That is might connected with what Bingyu talk about, contemporary employment. These are connected because of how we can understand the migration in inland in inland China and also internationally. So with that said, I will turn this time to Bingyu to answer this, how this pandemic impact her research participants.
Actually, some of my students and I have started to do this side research project called the immobilities of Chinese international students during the pandemic period. I actually mentioned in the beginning of the presentation as well. So we basically interviewed 20 to 40, so we interviewed two types of Chinese international students who are impacted by the COVID-19. So the first type is those Chinese international students who were supposedly to pursue their studies overseas in 2020, but have instead decided to take online courses staying in China due to the pandemic. The second type are those students who rescheduled their studying abroad plans, either not going anymore, like trying to study in China, or just finding jobs in China. And then another type is they rescheduled their study plans, just as Shuning mentioned, maybe not for college students. So my interview is they turned to Sino-foreign universities like Shanghai, NYU, Ningbo, Nottingham, and those hybrid universities. So we conducted research with those Chinese international students. We have found quite interesting findings. But as to Yi'en's question, I think I want to say that because I'm collaborating with some scholars from the UK and Australia to apply an ESRC project, that we are trying to write an application. During this process, we have found that the Chinese international students going to the UK has already exceeded the amount of going to the US and Australia, those countries. So I mean, you guys should know that the US-China tensions in terms of the talent war. So many Chinese international students are reconsidering the option of going to the US. So UK has naturally, inevitably become the most preferred destination during this COVID decade. I mean, we could call it a COVID decade. And then the second influences brought by the COVID-19 is that immobilities. I think we should give second thought on this newly emerged immobility fetish that scholars have started to shift their focus onto immobilities instead, rather than on mobilities. That we should know that immobilities is not necessarily disempowering or negative. They can actually redefine the way that people identify themselves and with their country and the way they identify with the state, with the culture as well. Many Chinese international students realize that maybe going overseas is kind of overrated or something. Like they realize during this quarantine time that they have started to rethink the existential meanings of their life. So many of them have actually started to put their focus on China, and also shift their study plan to Sino-foreign universities instead. And also the third influences, or maybe the third thing that we should consider in terms of theoretical approach towards those newly emerged mobilities and immobility landscapes is that I really think migration infrastructure is very, I really like this approach, is that we termed it as knowledge mobility infrastructure, so KMI. So I think we should look at multiple levels of those KMI, how they are being reshaped during this specific time period. That how the national governments are reshaping their border control, and how people are perceived as dangerous, or what kind of people are perceived as clean, as you know, like virus free or something like that, and how should we understand the more technological infrastructure are playing increasingly important role in reshaping people's perceptions towards their mobilities and immobilities, like digital campus and online course taking and all those WeChat, TikTok, and Twitter. All those social media platforms are becoming more and more particularly important during this COVID-19 period. Just like now, tonight, like I even couldn't, it was quite frustrating that I couldn't even log on to Zoom. You guys couldn't hear me, but I could hear you guys well. Maybe Zoom was, not the most preferred app in China compared to the other one. Maybe that's why. Hopefully that's not the reason. Anyway, so and also we should look at how those everyday level of infrastructures, like their family, friends, and also the intermediaries for us, like academics, for example, like Shuning and Yi'en or Heidi could potentially become my intermediaries if I ever, trying to negotiate or navigate through academic labor market overseas. So that's another sort of KMI, knowledge mobility infrastructure. I think during this pandemic period, those kind of multiple levels of infrastructure should be taken into more consideration now. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Bingyu, for your very wonderful answer. Touching upon the notion of infrastructures. I think we've come to the end of our seminar today. Thank you everyone for joining us on this seminar. We haven't been able to take all the questions that have been sent in, but we will be sure to send the list of questions to the speakers, both Shuning and Bingyu, so that they sort of know what are the kinds of things and topics that our audience are interested in. Once again, thank you very much, and thank you to both our speakers, Shuning and Bingyu. Thank you for your presentations. So we will say goodbye to everyone. Thank you.